If you have a Bible, can I encourage you to open it up to Matthew chapter 6? And I want to read to you again, this final message is going on in this series in the Lord's Prayer. So we're going to read the Lord's Prayer again in just a moment or two. I want to remind you of what it is that Jesus says about prayer before he introduces this prayer to us. A little bit earlier in the passage when he's speaking about prayer, he says, "But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you." And it is a striking thing that although many Christians struggle to develop a personal devotion and walk with the Lord, a friendship and communion with him, it is without question the expectation of Jesus as he begins to introduce this prayer and teach us how to pray. It's his expectation that every one of us can enjoy something of a close walk and fellowship and deepening communion with God in a very personal and individual way. The Christian faith is not an individualistic faith. There is so much that can only be experienced and enjoyed within the context of the church family and community. But there is this expectation that it's undergirded by and empowered by the reality that every believer can know God in a very personal and intimate way. And I trust that over the course of this series that there has been some encouragement to you to pursue God in a deeper way and to develop very deliberately and consciously to pursue that deeper walk with him. Now we're coming to the end of this prayer, and I want to read it to you one last time as familiar words, and we'll focus on the last line of this prayer. Jesus said, "Pray then like this." It's Matthew chapter 6, verse 9 there. "Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." Now, one of the things that perhaps has puzzled you when we've been looking at this prayer over the weeks that have gone by is potentially the fact that if you learned this prayer as a child, you might have learned it with another line on the end of it. When you say, "For yours is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever. Amen." And it may surprise you to know that that line is not original in the original manuscripts and was some kind of later addition. And it's not really confusing as to why it was added. There seems to be a strange finality, almost a dropping off the cliff at the end of this prayer, when the last line of the prayer is, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." Stop. And whereas so much of the prayer has been positive in its outlook, the longing for and desire for God's kingdom, for daily bread, for his grace in our lives, this element, this final aspect of the prayer seems to be surprisingly negative. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. I think it's not particularly confusing then as to why someone at some point felt that they needed to kind of round the prayer off with a more positive vibe at the end. "For yours is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever. Amen." But to do so, in a sense, diminishes the force of what Jesus wanted to say to us in the way he deliberately ended his prayer. Ask yourself, why did he end in this way? Now, I think to understand that, you have to recognize the place of prayer in the life of the Christian and what prayer does for us spiritually. And of course, there are many answers to that. But one of the things that ought to be a characteristic of your experience of walking with God personally in prayer day after day is that prayer becomes for you a refuge. And it's not to say that prayer is always easy. I don't believe that, and certainly that's not been true to my experience. But it is also true that prayer has a potency to it in that there's nothing quite like being in the presence of the Lord and pouring your heart out to him in this way, to experience something of the refuge in all the chaos of life. It's one of the characteristics attached to prayer is that very often in the New Testament it's associated with the experience of peace. And it's certainly been my experience. You could think of it in different ways. That if life throws at you all kinds of chaos, there's a sense in which walking through the experiences and the adversities and the challenges of day-to-day life is like walking through a storm. To spend time with the Lord in prayer should feel like walking into the warmth of a refuge. You can imagine, can't you, what it was like before motorways and cars and electric streetlights existed. To travel from one place to another meant to travel often in the cold and bleak and darkness of muddy paths, and then to see a warm glow from an inn or a pub on the roadside, when you knew inside there was a roaring fire, a warm ale, maybe some salted meat, something to fill your stomach and make you feel warmth in every part of your body. That must have been an appealing vision. It still is, isn't it, on a cold winter's night, to see a warm pub to walk into. And I think in a sense, that's the kind of experience the believer has coming into the presence of the Lord. Or to change the analogy, if life can feel dry and arid like a desert, prayer is the oasis in the desert. It's the experience of entering into the Lord's presence to drink deeply, to glug back refreshing, cool water when you feel a dryness of your ordinary life. And so it seems to me that when Jesus ends in this particular way, there's a sense in which he's equipping us for the reality of what it means to face life outside of that moment before the Lord in prayer. It's not to say, of course, that when we leave our rooms to go and face life, that we somehow leave God's presence. I don't believe that for a moment. But I do acknowledge and recognize that there is something unique about the conscious, deliberate aspect of prayer, stepping into the presence of the Lord, and that when we then go into the rest of life, we go into our lives with all the distractions and the chaos and the many things, the challenges and responsibilities and reasons to feel concern or anxiety or heaviness or responsibility. And that can very quickly dissipate the serenity and the peace that you may have experienced in prayer. And with that comes a number of dangers. And this, to me, is why Jesus ends on this very serious note. It's kind of a wake-up call. All of the prayer is serious and weighty, of course. But there's a sense in which this end to the prayer is a moment for commissioning and equipping. It reminded me of what Paul says to the believers in Ephesus when he challenges them in this way. He says, "Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore," he says, "take up the whole armor of God." You can read on in the rest of Ephesians 6 how he describes the various pieces of armor that are necessary in order to face the challenges of life. And I think it's in that vein that Christ is speaking here. You've begun to discover something as you've entered into the presence of the Lord, of the sweetness of of intimacy with him, of friendship with him. And there it feels like your cares and concerns have been left at the cross, as it were, or laid out before him. But now you must face life. And there's a warning in this, a seriousness to it, an urgency to this last line of the prayer. And I think a lot of it turns on just one word. To understand what Christ is equipping us for and preparing us for and calling us to pray about, it turns on this word that is translated here, temptation. Lead us not into temptation. Now, it's an ambiguous word because it can be translated in a positive or negative way, depending on its context in the New Testament. The positive sense is translated as a test or a trial. And this is something that's ordained by God for your good and your growth in the faith. God never tempts us to sin, but he does allow us to be exposed to testing and to trials. So it's used in this positive way in James chapter 1. He says, when you meet trials of various kinds, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. Why? Because he says, you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. In other words, there's a type of growth that will escape your experience, will not be yours unless you go through tests and trials in the Christian life. He says further on, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he'll receive the crown of life." So there is a way in which we can understand the tests and trials that we go through in life as gifts to us from God for our own growth, as opportunities to grow and to prove the work that God has put in us and to reveal it and so that it comes out. It reminds me of that proverb in Proverbs 17 where the author says that the crucible is for silver, a crucible being a vessel in which the metal could be heated to a very high temperature. The crucible is for silver and the furnace is for gold, but the Lord tests hearts. In other words, the adversities and challenges of life that we go through are refining experiences for our purification and growth, and therefore can be gifts to us from God. But, when Jesus uses the same language here, there is no question, I think, that it is translated well here when it's translated temptation, because what is being described here is not an opportunity from God for our growth, but rather a stumbling block from Satan for our destruction and our failure. Its intended end is something very much the opposite to your growth. And Jesus warns us about this in more than one place. It's here, obviously, in the prayer, as we've just heard. But it's also there in Matthew 26 when he says, "Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." So what Jesus is doing here, then, if I can just summarize at the outset, is he's calling upon you. Wake up, friend. As much as prayer can be a beautiful, serene, peace-filled, joy-filled, hope-filled experience, the reality of life, the New Testament shows us again and again and again, is one of spiritual warfare that you must be prepared for. Be sober-minded, the New Testament says. Wake up, it says elsewhere. Why must the Christian pray like this? I want to show you a few answers to that question this evening. And I trust that it'll do you good and help you and equip you to live for Christ. The first answer that I want to give to you is this: that you pray like this because you see the danger for what it is. You see what Christ is pointing to here as the danger that faces you in life. Now, before we understand the danger, I just want to wind back for a second and consider with you what it is that ought to be the goal and ambition and desire that's at the heart of Christian maturity and growth. And I think one of the answers is this, perhaps the central answer is this, that the Christian desires above all else Christ and Christ-likeness. When you were not a believer, and perhaps that's a description of you even now, you had no real concern with holiness. It was perhaps an archaic word that has no real interest to you. And the idea of pursuing righteousness feels like a foreign concept to you. Life is about personal fulfillment. It's about fulfilling your desires, isn't it? That's the general understanding. And you do what you feel is right. You do what you want. But when you become a Christian, there is something new that is implanted within you, a new urge, a new passion, a new reflex or instinct within inside you, which is a desire, a longing to pursue holiness and pursue Christ himself. And I don't mean it in a kind of negative sense, a legalistic sense. I know that it's possible to be uptight in a religious way, in which all of your passion and urgency and effort in the Christian faith or in any faith is driven by negative motives. And that breeds joyless, rigid, fragile believers. That's not what I'm talking about here, but I'm talking rather about the language of longing and desire and love. I'm talking about the way in which, as a Christian, you become enamored with the person of Christ. In fact, it's one of the evidences that you are a Christian, that there is, whether it's a flame or perhaps just a flicker inside you, but there is inside you a desire to be nearer to Jesus and to be more like him. You want it above all. That's the overall goal in the Christian faith: holiness, Christ-likeness, nearness to him. And so you become acutely aware of the ways in which you fall short of that and you're longing to grow. That's the trajectory and the contour of Christian faith. Now consider with me then, what is it? If you want something in life above everything else, it will be true that you will quickly begin to identify any hindrance to attaining the thing you want. If you become fanatic about fitness, you'll also become more and more, you will educate yourself on the things that you shouldn't be putting in your mouth, the stuff you shouldn't be eating, because it becomes a hindrance to your great goal in life, if that's your great goal. Or if you become fanatical about success, people who pursue success above all learn to pull various things out of their life for good or ill that they see as hindrances to their success. Sometimes these examples of this in our ordinary life can be quite fascinating and admirable. A few years ago, I read the story, a short article about a man called Wesley So, who I suspect most of you haven't heard of. I hadn't at the time. But Wesley So was a 23-year-old, at the time in 2017, he was a 23-year-old chess grandmaster who had been something of a child prodigy, but there was little expectation that he was going to attain to very much. Someone commented about him that he was seen as an up-and-coming player who lacked the strategic polish needed for elite play. But Wesley So confounded expectations in that year by winning the US chess national championship and has gone on to win successive championships subsequent to that. And when he was interviewed in 2017 about what had changed in his life, that this new rigor and this new determination and this new effort had come into his life to actually, when he'd become professional, so that he was able to reach the highest echelons in his field. This is what he said. Listen, he said, when I decided to try for a professional career, I thought about what I needed: more time to study and less stress. Both came immediately when I turned away from the internet. I found that fascinating. It goes on and says, there's only one cell phone in this family, and it belongs to my sister, who is very capable of dealing with any unpleasantness that tries to enter through it. I've had no social media for almost 2 years, and I'm alive, healthy, and happy. And the fruit is there to be seen in that man's life. He has gone on to be, he's right up there in the very top chess players in the world right now, and will no doubt remain there for many years to come. But I only tell you his story as an example of what I'm describing here. When you long for something in life above anything else, you will never attain that thing unless you begin to be aware of the threats, the dangers, the hindrances, the encumbrances that might prevent you from getting to where you want to be. And so it seems to me that the Christian who has a desire implanted by God to pursue holiness will become very quickly aware, and perhaps in increasing measure, more aware in the years that follow your turning to Christ, of the great threat, the great danger, the great thing that would cause you to remain stunted or to fall away, and that thing is temptation. As you grow in faith, you begin to realize that this threat is very real and present, and that it's everywhere. There's a spiritual element to it. In the New Testament, it talks about Satan's work to oppose us. It says in 1 Peter 5, be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. And Peter wanted the believers to be conscious, to be awake, to be alert to the very real spiritual danger that we're in. If you're sleeping or you're cruising or you're blasé in the Christian life, you're prey, he's saying. You become aware of the conflict in your own soul. Romans 7, Paul describes it in such vivid language when he says, I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. And he's describing that inner turmoil and the agony that can exist within the human soul between what you would want and what then you impulsively choose to do in any given moment. And then add to that the reality that just about every circumstance of life presents unique temptations to you. The bad and the good. You enter into bad experiences in life, and you're tempted to distrust the Lord, turn away from him, and find good outside of him because you say, well, this isn't working for me. You go through good experiences of life in which you experience God's favor and blessing poured out on you, and the temptation then is to forget him. So no matter what you're going through in life, temptation is there because Satan wants to trip you up or devour you, as Peter says, because your own heart is a conflicted mess, and because every circumstance of life presents unique temptations to us all. And in view of all this, you begin to realize Jesus wants us to be awake when he says, lead us not into temptation. Be alert, Christian. Be alert. I want to say, by the way, as an aside here, that we mustn't be confused, because at no point in the Bible does it say that temptation in and of itself is sinful. All of us will face temptations. Martin Luther put it vividly like this. He says, you can't stop the birds from flying over your head, but you can stop the nesting in your hair. And he was saying, temptations will pass over you constantly in life. Your role is to stop them gaining access, nesting, gaining a foothold in your heart and your soul. You pray like this because you become aware of the great danger that is temptation. Let me give you a second reason why we have to pray like this. You pray like this because you are not only aware of the danger, but you're also then aware of your own weakness and vulnerability because of the fragility of our fleshly nature. Now, in speaking like this, I want to be careful. When we focus on weakness, there is a danger that we can trip into a kind of defeatist mentality as Christians. And I think this is a very real problem for many, many believers. The problem with defeatism, in which you begin to think that it becomes almost an inevitability that when you're tempted, you're going to fall, you're going to stumble, you're going to give in. This becomes a self-fulfilling problem within the life of the Christian. And the New Testament is very clear in showing us that sin is never inevitable, and that there's no sense in which we ought to indulge in that kind of defeatist mentality. Romans 6 is perhaps the most encouraging chapter in the Bible on this particular theme, and it tells us truths like this. It says in Romans 6, verse 6, that we know that our old self, speaking of our lives before we encountered Jesus, our old self was crucified with him. We've died, in order that the body of sin might be brought to nothing, so that we'd no longer be enslaved to sin. It says, once you were a slave. That's the verdict, the diagnosis of the New Testament. But when your life died with Christ on the cross, the experience of the process of conversion, that old life that was a slave to sin is no longer the life you now live. You're no longer a slave. And if you're not a slave, then you're not compelled. That's the logic of the New Testament. You are a free person. And more than that, he goes on later in this chapter to explain the work of God in your heart. He says in Romans 6, verse 17, but thanks be to God that you who were once slaves of sin have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed. You were a slave, he says, now you have new desires. And your desires, you see, it's one thing to tell yourself to do the right thing. It's another thing to want to do the right thing. And how hard it is to change your wants. But part of the grace of God that's at work in the life of the Christian is exactly that. That the Lord doesn't leave you enslaved to your own passions, as it were, bound up in your own evil desires. He begins to unravel all of that and give you new desires. So that you now obey, he says, from the heart. You're obedient from the heart. You long to do Christ's will. And there's one verse that seems to me to be really powerful and clarifying on this issue of defeatism in the Christian life. He says in Romans 6:11 that you must consider yourselves dead to sin and alive to God in Christ Jesus. He's saying it's not just a matter of the facts about you. The fact is you're no longer a slave. The fact is you're now a child of God and free. He says you must also consider that to be true in your mind. This is a matter of your faith and of your believing, and of your self-conscious awareness of yourself. You see, if you think of yourself as a slave to sin, there is no question but that you will be trapped in deeper and deeper cycles of sin. But if you become aware, as Paul says, consider yourself alive to God. Part of the freedom of the Christian life comes in that confidence that's bred by knowing God is at work in me and I am changing. I am not a slave. I am a free person in the Lord. And therefore I am not compelled to sin ever. So I want to steer a clear, wide berth around a mentality of defeatism when we speak about weakness. But I still think it's important to be aware of the reality of our fleshly desires, of our weakness, of our proclivities and our tendencies to want to do things that displease the Lord. And it's not, as I said, to foster this defeatism, but it's because we need to foster humility. Our enemy here is pride. Pride will keep you out of the prayer closet. It's an archaic way of speaking of the place where you go to pray to the Lord. Prayer will keep you in a state of independence and self-sufficiency. Pride will tell you that you're doing fine and that you're okay. And pride will inevitably lead you to a crashing fall. But the humble believer is the person who casts themselves upon the Lord in desperate dependence, saying, I am not capable in myself. I am only capable because of the grace of God at work in me. And humility will drive you to your knees in urgent and desperate prayer. Humility will cause you to call out to God for more of His Holy Spirit, for light from His Word so that you can see the path that you need to walk in, for new desires and a passion to follow His will. I think we have very good reasons to be humble then. Not defeated, but humble. One of them is, Satan is smarter than you. And I say that because I look at the way he tempted Jesus. You'll know, if you know the story of Christ in the wilderness and how he encountered the succession of temptations, that Satan used Scripture to attempt to stumble Jesus himself. Has it ever struck you that Satan knows how to run rings around our reasoning at times? He can even use the Bible itself. He knows it better than you or I do. I know as a pastor that I've lost count of the number of times when people are making tragic decisions, particularly in the area of sexual ethics, because they say, well, I've gone back to the Bible and I've done my research. And what they mean by that is they've scrolled a few websites that have given them some very dodgy perspectives, and they've rationalized their wrong way of living and acting. That's the enemy's work. He's smarter than us. He knows how to stumble us. Use an analogy here. You know these great tech giants, Facebook or Meta, as they've now cleverly rebranded so that we've forgotten all the evils of the past, and Google. These companies, their business model is built upon knowing everything about you. As much information as possible about you. Why? So that they can not only exploit your wants, your desires, by targeting you with advertising, but also by predicting the things you didn't even know you wanted. In other words, they have this way of understanding your personhood and then finding the vulnerabilities so that they can make money from advertisements. And I'm not saying necessarily that these companies are satanic, but it does strike me that this is precisely the way that Satan operates. By knowing a lot about you and then exploiting your vulnerabilities by enticing you with things you didn't even know you wanted, getting under your skin, as it were, getting into your heart. And this is why we have to be humble. Satan is smarter than you. He's smarter than me. Another reason is that we see all through the Bible that the greatest saints fail. If they fail, then what makes us think that we can stand? John Owen puts it in a kind of almost despairing question. How shall I stand when such mighty pillars have fallen to the ground? And the Bible is replete with examples of men and women who seem to be men and women of great faith, but who then have crashed and burned and fallen in all kinds of tragic and dramatic ways. It's part of the wonder of Scripture, in my mind, the honesty of it. And Paul says, look, they were written for our example, so we will not do as they did. You have to learn from this. You have to be humbled by it. That's how you learn. And if it's not good enough for you to read the Bible and discover these things, just look at the Christian scene all around us. Browse any Christian news website, and you'll see story after story. It feels like a no man's land at times, where you just see craters from the destruction and dead tree trunks from the destruction of Satan's work among Christians in the church, that even the greatest and mightiest among us crash and fall. Satan's smarter, greater saints than you or I have fallen. Your own story tells you, doesn't it, of your weakness, and ought to foster a humility within you as it does within me. And then, of course, there's Jesus' words to us. Words that I've already referenced in Matthew 26, when he's praying with his disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he says to them, watch and pray that you will not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. That is not just a statement that was valid for that specific moment in time. It is a very general statement of verdict about human nature. The spirit may be willing, but the flesh is weak. The wise Christian hears this instruction to pray as Christ taught us to pray, and recognizes this is a prayer I need. Not only because, as I've said, the danger is out there, but also because my weakness makes me vulnerable to it. Danger, weakness. And let me bring you one final reason why I believe we need to pray this prayer. You pray like this because you see Christ's readiness to help you. His willingness, his love and tender passion to help you. Now, I know that for some of you, this is not the first thing you think about when you think about Jesus. And how you perceive the Lord's heart and attitude towards you is a powerfully controlling dynamic in your experience of the faith. When I was about 13 years of age, I took part in an inter-school cross-country race. If any of you didn't grow up here in England, cross-country is a sport that takes place in usually the coldest months of the year, when we run across fields in the mud with blistering cold wind and rain blowing on us, and it's supposed to be fun. So we run about 5 kilometers or so, and I hadn't trained for it. My school wasn't really a sporting type of school. They just chucked us into these events to see what would happen. It was like a blood fest, I suppose. So I went to this event, and within about 100 meters, I knew I was in trouble. Because there at the front was this lad about my height, but with long mane of flowing ginger hair. I can remember it to this day, sprinting off into the distance. I mean, he had pretty much doubled the distance on me within about a few hundred meters. It was unbelievable. And of course, you feel dismay at that point. But I just thought, I'm just going to run the best race I can. So I carried on running. And I ran and ran. And I was probably somewhere halfway through the pack, I suppose. And you know how it is when you do a long distance run. There's usually 2 or 3 others that you're running with, that you're kind of competing with. And I got to the end. And as always happens to me in any kind of middle distance race, I have done a few. You wouldn't believe it looking at me, but I've done park runs and so on. What always happens to me at the end of these runs is that I feel a fresh burst of adrenaline and energy. Who knows where it comes from? It's like the nitro kicks in. And I start to sprint at the end. And I thought, this is it. I haven't won, but I can beat this guy and this guy. And so I started to sprint with the finish line within sight, just maybe 50 meters away. And there at the side of the course was a teacher, a PE teacher from another school who I never saw, had never met and didn't know me. And he looked me in the eye as I was running. And he started to shout at me, "What's the point? It's too late now," mocking me in this way. And, this is lived in my memory, not just because of the cruelty of doing that to a 13-year-old boy. I mean, it killed any desire I have to ever run cross-country again, I can tell you that, if I had any desire to ever do it again. But it seems to me to be a picture of how some of you think about your relationship with the Lord. It's like you're already failing. And you begin to think, well, even my efforts are inadequate and a reason to be mocked and scorned. When you think about Jesus, when your perception of Christ is as a hard taskmaster in this way, only one of two things has to happen to your spiritual life. Either you will be the kind of person who tends towards, well, I must try harder because I want to please him. And that's the mindset of the legalist, believing that you can attain some kind of standard that will make you worthy. For many of us, it's the opposite. You think, well, I've already failed. What's the point? I may as well just hang about at the back and stroll because I've already failed. And this is the mentality of license. It's like, well, I might as well just do what I feel is right because I may as well get some enjoyment out of life. And some people's Christian lives are hamstrung and crippled by this problem at the heart, that you don't know the heart of the Lord Jesus Christ for you. And therefore, maybe you bounce between those two options. In 1 minute, you're feeling hopeful and you're striving to please Jesus. And then you fail again, and then you crash into a pit of despair. What you never do is experience just the joy of daily grace, of living under his smile and his kindness and his favor and his love that propels you and energizes you to live the life. I want to remind you of what the Bible says about Jesus and his heart towards us as tempted, afflicted people. It says in the Psalms that he remembers that we're dust. And then there are these precious words in the book of Hebrews that have meant so much to me over the years. In Hebrews 2, he's describing the profound reality of our Savior becoming flesh. Christmas. He said he had to be made like his brothers in every respect. He had to be made like you and me in every way so that he could become a merciful and faithful high priest. Merciful and faithful. He says, because he himself has suffered when tempted, he's able to help those who are being tempted. The help that Jesus brings, in other words, is the help of an older brother who has endured what you're enduring, who understands the affliction of temptation, the fire of temptation, who understands the agony and the pain and the draw and the enticement and the lure of it also, and who therefore looks at you with eyes of compassion and sympathy and tenderness when you are going through the fire. And so as I read at the beginning of the service, these verses in Hebrews 4, a couple of chapters later, it says we don't have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. Someone who's so far above us, as it were, removed and distant from us that it has no comprehension of what it is that we're going through. He says that's not Jesus. He said we have one who in every respect has been tempted as we are. Is that not a mind-boggling thought? How are you tempted? Do you know Jesus was tempted in a similar way? Not necessarily in the exact same way, but the same category of sin. He's been tempted in every respect as been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then, with confidence, draw near to the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. I cannot tell you how important that line of scripture has been for me in sustaining me and helping me, particularly over the last couple of decades as I've sought to mature into manhood as a believer and sought to rely on his grace every day. Let us then with confidence, not halteringly, not hesitantly, not with uncertainty or doubt or fear. Confidence. boldness, you step into the presence of the Lord. Why? Not because there's something special about you, but because of His mercy, His grace, His sympathy, His love, His compassion towards you. So if ever there's a prayer that we know is in line with the will of the Lord, it's this one. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. You can be on your face before the Lord at any moment and know that is a prayer He wants to answer on your behalf. He wants to help you, friend. And how does the Lord deliver us? Well, perhaps by miraculously removing the temptation from your life. Or perhaps, as I've already mentioned, by changing your heart so that you no longer desire the things you once desired. I love that line in Psalm 51 where David says, he prays, "Create in me a clean heart and renew a right spirit within me, O God." It's a remarkable thing. You may even not perceive this happening, but you don't desire the things today that you desired 5-10 years ago if you're walking with the Lord for any length of time. And in 20-30 years' time, you won't desire the things you desire now that are wrong. You will change. You are changing. Take heart. You won't remain as you are. The Lord is rewiring, reconfiguring, and rebuilding your heart, your soul, your desires. As part of His answer to this prayer, lead us not into temptation. At some point, friend, take heart. You won't even want it. Another thing He does is He teaches you how to avoid the temptation in the first place. He gives you the mind of Christ, wisdom from above, heavenly wisdom, so as to know how to make wise choices that do not put you in trouble. We've been reading the Lord's Prayer that's recorded in Christ's Sermon on the Mount. But in the same sermon, He talked to us about the example of, within the context where He's teaching about lust, He says, if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. So it's better to enter life maimed than to enter some kind of destruction with an able body. Christ is teaching us this, that it's no use praying, "Lead us not into temptation," desperately on your knees before the Lord, and then immediately standing up and walking into the very context and situation in which you experience it. Part of Christ's answer to this prayer will be giving you the wisdom and the resolve to make those radical choices that involve cutting things out of your life, necessarily cutting them out of your life. And I should say also that when a Christian engages in this kind of abstinence or this kind of self-negation, this way of whittling back your options deliberately, this is not a cause for pride, friend, as though you can stand there in a position of superiority and saying, well, I don't do this or that or the other thing. It's rather an admission of your weakness. It's saying, I cannot do these things because I'm too vulnerable. You can take the image of the alcoholic. The alcoholic doesn't go around saying, well, I don't touch alcohol. The alcoholic says, I can't touch alcohol. And that's how Christ can give you wisdom, the wisdom from above, to make wise choices so that you do not live a life that is constantly blundering into temptation after temptation and then expecting some kind of miraculous deliverance. That's folly, friends. Christ can give you wisdom from above. Another thing the Bible tells us He does to answer this is He can set limits upon the temptation itself, and He does do this. In 1 Corinthians 10, it's put in this wonderful way. He says, no temptation has overtaken you that's not common to man. In other words, friend, don't buy the myth that what you're facing is unique. Countless other believers have faced the same thing. And then he says, God is faithful, and He'll not let you be tempted beyond your ability. What an encouraging verse. What it's saying is this, that God will never allow you to experience a temptation that you cannot resist. It may feel like that in the moment, but that's a myth, that's a lie, that's the defeatism I was speaking about earlier. You're not tempted beyond your ability. And this is part of the wonderful way in which Christ protects us and guards us. Another thing He does is He gives you a way out in the midst of temptation. It says later in that very same verse, it says He'll not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation, He'll also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. And this will be the experience, your testimony, as you observe your life over years, that there have been times when you were close to doing something that you could have regretted, but God, by his grace, supernaturally provided you with an escape route, an ejector seat, a button to press and pop, you're gone. No longer in the danger zone. An analogy here, if you drive a car in the UK, if you are driving, you're crossing the brow of a hill into a very steep gradient, there'll be a warning sign that will tell you to shift into a low gear. The risk here, of course, is that if you're just relying upon the brakes constantly down a steep hill, the brakes may fail. And sometimes, for some unfortunate drivers, they do. What do you do in that instant where it feels like the car is running away from you, you have no way of stopping it? Sometimes that's exactly how temptation feels, doesn't it? It's like things are progressing at a speed that I cannot stop now. And the builders of roads build a safety mechanism into the road, as it were, in the slip roads, where you can, if your brakes fail on your car, you can quickly steer off to the left or to the right and find yourself on an uphill slope that will stop the car. And there's a sense in which what Paul's saying is that is exactly what the Lord does for us when we're facing the temptations that come from Satan. He gives you a way out. You better take it. That's the answer to your prayer, friend. John Owen, commenting, he was a Puritan in the 1600s, commenting on that verse, he said, "The promise is made to those who meet temptation in their way." You're going about your business, you meet temptation in your way, and not to those who go out of their way to meet with it. It's a sobering line. You go in search of temptation, please don't expect the deliverance from the Lord in the same way. But when you stumble into it, God's going to be there with you to help you. And let me tell you one final way in which I believe the Lord helps us. He helps you by satisfying you with his love. Sin and temptation gain a foothold in the life of the Christian when they are compounded by a sense of guilt, shame, and accusation, a sense of unworthiness. And the Christian who sits in a puddle of unworthiness and guilt feelings and condemnation that comes from Satan is a very vulnerable Christian. This is one of his devices to trip you, to cause you to fail, to prevent you from seeking the Lord's love and compassion, from keeping you from him in a dark state of mind and heart and soul. The power of the gospel is the relentless love of a Savior who has paid for your sin in its entirety, past, present, and future, and who is ready at the slightest flicker of repentance in our hearts to meet us with fountains of mercy and grace, so that you never have to sit in a position of feeling condemned and unworthy. You only need to come back to him and ask. And the love of Christ has a disarming power about it to undo the power of temptation in the life of the Christian. Because temptation has been inflamed by this sense of unworthiness and distance from the Lord. But when you suddenly are bathed with the cool, refreshing waters of his love, that raging fire is put out. He satisfies you in his love. What a wonderful thing to bathe in the grace of God and to know that you belong to him. We are going to take communion in a moment, but I want us to take a couple of minutes here to have a very personal response with the Lord. I know that there are some of you who will have felt nothing but just the encouragement and strengthening of a message like this and a verse like this to go on as you are going. But there are some of you who are sat in that puddle I've been describing. The cycle of failure and guilt and shame that perpetuates failure. And the Lord Jesus wants to invite you back to his table of grace. We eat the bread, we drink the wine, as a sensory experience to know I am accepted, I have a place at the table. But before you eat, before you drink, maybe you need to come to the Lord and say, God, I'm here. And I'm coming with all of my mess. And I want you to help me. Lead me not into temptation. Deliver me from evil. When you pray this prayer with a sincere heart, expect the Lord to surround you with his love. Expect him to come and help you. It may be sufficient in itself to turn a corner. It may also be the case that the Lord wants you to make certain steps, to speak with somebody who can minister the grace of God to you, to walk with a friend, to make wise choices based on the counsel and advice of wiser, more mature believers. There are all kinds of ways, but the important moment is here and now. I want to encourage you to bow your head. The musicians are going to come and lead us in a responsive worship in a moment, but we're going to have just a quiet now. Bow your head. Still your heart. And speak to the Lord. Just tell him what you need. Tell him where you're at. Tell him what you want. Tell him how you feel. And ask him for his grace. Father God, we come to you with all of our mess. And thank you for the wonder of the blood of Christ. Thank you for the sufficiency of his death upon the cross as a sacrifice of atonement to completely eradicate our sin and its effects, to absorb the sting of it and the wrath that you had against our sin. And Lord, if we see you as the Savior who died for us to redeem us, we know that you must be the Savior who thou wants to help us, who is for us. And I pray, Lord, that the confidence of knowing you as a friend, as a sympathetic high priest, as a brother, with an unrelenting, unconditional, passionate love for us as your people, may that knowledge permeate our souls and our spirits. May it reshape and refashion how we think and approach you, so that we can pray this prayer, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. We can pray it with hope and confidence rather than in a position of defeatedness and weakness. We can pray it in reliance. And I pray, Lord, for my brothers and sisters, Lord, that you will equip us to be strong in the Lord, to be sober-minded, to be watchful, to put on the armor of God, to stand firm, so that as we experience the onslaught of life in this world, this broken world, we'll have within us an invulnerable demeanor because we know the love of God. We know the Savior. Give us strength, I pray, to run and to walk with you. In Jesus' name.